This week, John Strand and I will discuss, a new segment, really. We've been, as we may have mentioned in the shows before, doing some analyst-style briefings with some companies. So I'm going to recap some of those briefings that I did with companies such as Ativo, Sixtera, Prevail, Sempiris, and Guardicore. Then in the security news, we're going to talk about Avast launching some new products. Carbon Black and SecureWorks strengthen their relationship. Shield X integrates an intention engine into an elastic security platform, and some updates from Imperva, White Source, BlackBerry, and more. So stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we talk security vendors and aren't afraid to name names. It's Enterprise Security Weekly. Improve the efficiency and effectiveness of your security operations with DF Labs security orchestration, automation, and response technology. Automate threat containment, orchestrate incident response, and measure operational performance with DF Labs in-command SOAR platform. Leverage your current security resources to minimize incident resolution time, maximize analyst efficiency, increase the number of incidents handled, and reduce overall risk. In-command SOAR acts as a force multiplier, enabling your security team to do more with less. Streamline the full incident response lifecycle automation process today. Keep your cybersecurity incidents under control with DF Labs. Visit dflabs.com/security weekly and request to see in-command SOAR live in action. Stop attackers from domain credential theft and lateral movement with a 99% success rate by using artificial intelligence to control the attacker's perception of the environment. Javelin Networks is the world's first endpoint intrusion containment platform to protect domain networks. Javelin detects targeted attacks and breaches by obfuscating Active Directory, domain controllers, domain identities, domain credentials, and all domain resources. It only takes one compromised machine to jeopardize the entire organization. Don't be a victim. Visit javelin-networks.com and request a demo of AD Protect today. Are you worried about PCI compliance? Does your development team understand or care about security? Are you ready to face a breach of your customer sensitive data? See the worst that can happen before it does. Black Hills Information Security can help you help management see the future. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a web application penetration test can mitigate the risk before you go live. Welcome everyone to episode 111 of Enterprise Security Weekly for October 17th, 2018. I'm, of course, your host, Paul Asadorian, joined by John Strand, coming to you from South Dakota. John, welcome to the show.
Howdy.
Good to have you here, my friend. It's kind of a different format for the show today. I'm excited, dude. I'm excited.
Yeah, this is kind of a change up. This is one of those things where we're constantly throwing curveballs at each other for any presentation we do.
Yeah.
So I'm excited about this. Let's do it.
So hold on. So a quick announcement first. If you're interested in quality over quantity and having meaningful conversations instead of just a badge scan, join us April 1st through the 3rd at Disney's Contemporary Resort for InfoSec World 2019, where you can connect and network with like-minded individuals in search of actionable information. We have a discount code for you. Use the code OS19-SECWEEK, SECWEEK, for 15% off the main conference or a world pass. Lots of fun at InfoSec World. It's a great conference. Hope to see many of our listeners there. And yes, John, so this segment is kind of interesting. It represents the kind of progression and evolution of Security Weekly, which I'm, of course, super excited about. And, you know, I think, John, when I had first left Tenable, one of my first things I wanted to do was take it from a couple of security podcasts and bring it to a network of security podcasts, right? The next evolution is to take us kind of deeper into that security industry side while maintaining that connection with the security community and be the connection between the two. In order to do that, we had to act like analysts. I think to support this show, Business Security Weekly, and support our advertisers, right, and our sponsors, who are really what I like to call partners. To support them, we really have to take on analyst briefings and act as an analyst in the industry. That'll also come into play in some announcements we have coming up as well. So I've been approaching, and it's interesting because I'm on the other side of the briefing. When I was at Tenable, and especially in product marketing, I was on the phone with analysts and doing the briefing. Now I'm the other side, playing the role of analyst with Matt Alderman and several others. And of course, John, you're more than welcome to sit in on any briefings.
And I have.
Yeah.
Yep.
And they're just, it's informative, right? The goal of this show, right? We said it when we started it. It was born out of frustration. We want to know what problems the vendors are solving, how they solve them, and what differentiates them primarily. And we get to do that now in briefings. And I have to say, most of the companies have been really awesome, right? Even if they've never heard of us before, a lot of these companies have been really, really awesome. There are some that you won't hear me recap a briefing because we haven't done a briefing with them. If you ask me privately, about a company, I may tell you the fact that they did not do a briefing yet, and that's not to knock them. There could be things that are going on. Maybe they're pivoting, maybe they're getting acquired, whatever the case may be.
There's also times, Paul, we won't talk about it publicly on the show. I know we say we're not afraid to name names, but there's times where we've talked to some firms, even before we even get to the point of a briefing, and it's very, very clear there's very systematic issues there. And we just tend to let those go and die on their own.
Yeah, and if I did a briefing and it's not mentioned on the show, it's not because it wasn't a good briefing. We're just trying to fit in the content any way that we can.
True.
So
good point.
Having said that, I did some pretty awesome briefings. I want to talk about Ativo first, John, because I think we misunderstood, or at least I misunderstood their announcement that they made, and really what their announcement is about. It's actually really exciting and a really cool technology. And so Ativo's in the deception space. You might be familiar with other players, in that deception space. That space has certainly evolved, and I think we've started to move past, and maybe have moved fully past the associating them with honeypots. I think there's still people that do. In taking briefings with several of these companies and talking to customers and whatnot, right? It's very much not that at all as the way you think of a traditional honeypot. And they're doing some really cool things. In Ativo, again, it was in the reverse direction as I initially understood it. They're basically allow you to apply deception and put that in your cloud environment, put that in your Lambda functions, which I thought was really awesome, and put that inside of your containers that you're deploying. And I'm like, well, that makes perfect sense. Why wouldn't I want to have a container that is implementing some kind of deceptive technology to collect information? That container reports back to the Ativo controller directly. And I'm like, with the way we deploy containers, why wouldn't we do that? I'm like, that actually makes a lot of sense in that environment.
Well, and we've been talking about the idea of cyber deception, active defense, all of that for, I think we're coming up on 6-7 years now. And it's really cool to see companies like Ativo and Elusive, Symmetria, Javelin, all of these different companies that are now coming up with solutions, like you said, that are not honeypots. They're just coming up with something creative as far as in the cyber deception space. And it's exciting for me because it's not the same crap repackaged. It's something brand new.
Right. Yeah, I think Javelin uses deception technologies. I wouldn't put them in the category of deception. And I think there's a couple of companies. We'll talk about Guardicore. They have a deception component to it. And I like that. We still have the traditional deception vendors, and you mentioned a few already. And I throw TrapX in there. Acalvio is actually going to do some work with us. So you'll see them featured on some shows this quarter, I believe, which is awesome. And so, they have those are the traditional, that's what we do is deception. I like that Javelin has incorporated some of the deception technologies, and you see Guardicore and others adopting some of those, even though that's not their main thing, but they're incorporating their strategy. So it really has matured quite a bit from the days of, I was brought back to university when I used to set up a darknet, and that was my version of deception, was to just put up some IP address space, make it routable, and that's how I was deceiving if someone was scanning the network. If you touch that network, I knew likely it was bad behavior, or at least behavior I might want to look at. We've come so much further. In fact, Ativo's supporting all the major cloud providers now, AWS, Azure, Google, OpenStack, and even Oracle Cloud, which is interesting. So they've got great support. They do the credential thing as well, right? They can deploy credentials, kind of similar to the Javelin, but they're doing it as a sheer deceptive play. They're deploying containers as decoys and Lambda functions. Now, the tricky thing about a Lambda function in a serverless environment where you're not deploying a container, you're not deploying a virtual machine on premise, and you're not deploying a platform or operating system up to the cloud, is when you deploy an application, it's just that. So where does it log, and how do you get those logs, right? If you can't build in
if
something.
you're actually creating the Lambda function itself, you can actually build that into the Lambda function, so it can generate its logs and its alerts to you. At least that's how I have read this, and when talking to them, that's what it's doing. It's actually telling you, hey, someone's interacting with me, and they really, really shouldn't be interacting with me.
Sure. And the strategy that Ativo went down was they're actually integrating with CloudWatch. So your Lambda functions are logged into CloudWatch, and Ativo has an integration into CloudWatch, so you can deploy all those, put deception in there, and they're going to pull that from the CloudWatch logs, which that made a lot of sense to me too. I'm like, that's great. Ativo's doing some great stuff. They are integrating, with the Chef and Puppet and orchestration platforms to include that in. And this is a deployment strategy I'm seeing more and more. You talk with Signal Sciences, and you talk with there was someone else I talked with that was basically deploying this way. They're like, when we deploy inside of a container, basically you include it as part of your build process. We're including either a Linux package or some kind of library that's allowing us to hook it. It's not like a traditional agent. You're basically just hooking it in your build process, and you're off to the races. For that reason, I really like containers and security as applied to the container because it's easy to deploy. So that's pretty awesome. And that's pretty much Ativo. John, any comments on the this space?
No, I just still come back to it. It's nice to sit back and smile. And it's really getting to the point now where we're no longer trying to find the best endpoint security vendor or the best firewall vendor. We're actually coming up with vendors that are innovating in brand new ways that we didn't even think of a few years ago. And that's really where this industry needs to go.
Absolutely. Yeah, and Ativo's got some pretty cool deceptive kind of like profiles, right? Like they can emulate SCADA, they can put up decoy MongoDBs, deceptive S3 shares, they can seed credentials and then drive them to an S3 share. So I think this has really become more of like a norm in the industry. Like you said, John, we're not trying to convince people that this is something they should do. I think the technology has matured and evolved and continues to do that over time, such that it's really a viable option for a lot of organizations to implement deception technologies, which is awesome. Alrighty. So Guardicore, their micro-segmentation. And the first time, when you hear that, right? Go ahead.
Could you cover that a little bit? Because I know that there's going to be people that have no idea what microsegmentation actually is.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You're hearing these terms like microsegmentation, and also zero trust is kind of built into there too. And what does that mean? Essentially, it means you're deploying something, an application or a system, and either through microsegmentation or what they dub as zero trust, you're able to define rules and policies for that application and do that in a really smart way such that as you're deploying, you can define, well, this application is this profile, so therefore automatically apply these rules, which tells it who can talk to it, how it can talk to other things, what things can talk to it on what protocols and what ports. So it's basically helping you simplify that segmentation so that you can do more of it. And I'm not saying that I think that when we think of microsegmentation, we think, well, every single application and system I deploy is going to have its own unique policy. That's not reality, right? We know that. You're creating groups. And so as you say, well, this application, supports my marketing or supports this user functionality, right? And every time we deploy an application of that type, we've already done the research to say these are the rules that get applied to it as to how it can talk, who can talk to what.
Well, and another way of looking at it is, you remember years ago when we were talking about firewall policies, we always talked about trying to establish the procedures in such a way that it was completely locked off as far as what different applications could access. Yep. Sorry, I've got someone calling me at a very inopportune moment. So we're going to shut that down. And basically, the goal was you needed to build your firewall policies from the ground up where nothing was working, and then you built it up step by step by step. And whenever you're thinking about microsegmentation, just using a firewall analogy, it allows you to do that type of very, very granular, very, very detailed rules, but then also reapplying them. Like Paul just mentioned, you can take an application. If that application is redeployed 3 more times, the same rule set can automatically be applied. So it's basically doing firewalling and segmentation the way that it always should have been done, but making it a lot easier than it was, 5-6 years ago.
Yeah, and I asked that question, and to make it easier, they've got visualization tools that allow you to profile your applications. So you basically run it in, it's kind of like, IDS, IPS, right? But you're deployed in an application, you put it in monitor mode, and you're like, okay, this is how I want it to talk. Here's where I don't want it to talk. Define the policy, and like John said, then you can reuse that policy. This is, I think, especially critical to those in hybrid cloud environments. You've got some stuff on premise, you've got some stuff in the cloud. So you can try and do this on those respective platforms, but it's not talking to each other. So you got to define it twice. If you go get something like a Guardicore, you can basically say, wherever I deploy this application, the hybrid cloud environment is a big use case for them. And I think a lot of people certainly have those problems, right? Like I got VMware on premise and I've got AWS. How do I manage everything the same?
Mm-hmm. And not have to go down to actual individual firewall rules every single time. Because it's kind of like, I can't remember the analogy someone said, whenever you're looking at the way we deployed applications years ago, we built a server as though it was a static entity. It was basically going to be built, it was going to be serving a function as long as we could possibly have it serving that function. Now, whenever you're looking at like containers, you're looking at like applications like Lambda, you're seeing these applications that'll spin up and die, spin up and die, spin up and die. And they're constantly evolving and they're constantly changing. And they may even be shifting IP addresses as well. So the traditional firewall rule sets that we worked with for a long time just do not work with those dynamic environments. And unfortunately, many organizations, if you're going back to what's the problem you're trying to solve, in hybrid cloud environments, most organizations just open it up so it's all accessible all the time because trying to maintain it is such a pain in the ass. However, if you're using something like a Guardicore and that type of microsegmentation, it makes it a lot easier to actually implement security policies that are mobile with your applications moving around.
What's interesting, kind of along similar lines, I spoke with the folks at Cyxtera. I'm really impressed with this technology. And I don't want to oversimplify it and say that it's only there to replace your VPN. I think that's a great use case. And what they tell me is after people execute the VPN replacement, they're like, wow, we can use it for all this other stuff. I think that was very telling about their, we look for indicators of a product that actually solves problems. And when they tell me that companies adopt it for this and then realize that it's so valuable, they use it for other things. To me, that speaks that it's solving problems, right? More than one, which is great. So I'll speak to it in the VPN replacement because it's the easiest way to understand it. And that is very similar to what you were talking about, John, is when I have a VPN and I VPN in the company, I basically can then see everything, right? And it's really hard to say, well, VPN users can only have access to this, and maybe this user has access to this, and how do you, there's firewall solutions that might be able to do that. How do I control who can see what, like once they're on the network and authenticate them, right? And so Cyxtera has what they call a AppGate SDP. It's the software-defined perimeter. It's actually a standard. I didn't realize this. It's actually an industry standard for defining protocols and how protocols work to create what's called a software-defined perimeter. So basically the way it works is you have an agent on your system. You talk to a controller, and you authenticate and exchange the crypto things and do all that stuff. I won't go into the details. And then according to your profile, you can only see, not just connect, but you can only see what you're supposed to see, right? So if there's an ERP application, if I'm logged in as a specific user who doesn't access that, I don't even see it. I don't see it at all. I can't even know that it's there.
Now, I can't remember. They integrate with Active Directory, right? So you can establish groups within Active Directory. You can assign people to those groups, and then the applications they'll be able to see will be associated with those groups in Active Directory, correct?
Correct. Yeah, it sounded like there was a few different integrations that would help you define like which user groups can access what. And once you set that up, it then talks to a gateway, and you can deploy multiple gateways, and that gateway handles the communication to your application, keeps it invisible to those that don't see it. What I liked about this is a lot more granular, much better definition than a VPN. Also, it limits that attacker view of your network. Let's say I do compromise some credentials or a user, I can only see what that user can see. It can limit what I might be able to do in Active Directory. If I'm not supposed to be accessing a share or accessing these other systems, they really just won't show up to me. And while I might be able to do some enumeration in Active Directory, I'm going to be very limited to my scope. And I thought that was really, and the other thing is there are similar, not similar, but there are other solutions, right? And what Matt Alderman and I were talking about is some of these other solutions, like for Cloud Broker and all that stuff, they're funneling everyone's connection through one gateway. What I thought was nice about the Cyxtera solution is you can put up as many gateways as you want, and so that application has that gateway, and it's not a bottleneck. When I go to a different application, there's another gateway, right? So it's not trying to funnel all of the remote traffic through one particular gateway. I thought that was a big differentiator for Cyxtera. And I thought it was a really cool technology. And I think you got to do, I want to go back and read more about the software-defined perimeter and the standards that are associated with it, because I thought that was really interesting, and I hadn't been exposed to that before.
Well, do you remember years ago, was one of the times I was out for Security Weekly, we got into a very interesting conversation about what happens whenever Active Directory isn't a thing anymore. And we all said, look, this is way off in the future, but it's going to happen. And you look at traditional architectures, you have an Active Directory environment, you have a DMZ, you're going to have a VPN endpoint, and it allows you to access the Active Directory environment. And once we're in that VPN, we're into everything, and we can spread around. But what happens whenever you don't have that Active Directory? You don't have that, that walled off, DMZ that has your internal users on the inside and the internet's on the outside. And this isn't a what if scenario. I mean, we see a lot of customers now at Black Hills Information Security that are newer organizations that completely forgo the complete Active Directory model, and then now they're moving absolutely everything, their apps, their authentication, their files, everything into the cloud. And how do you even approach trying to secure that? And I think that this is an interesting approach, and I really hope, I like this approach, the idea of making direct connections into the individual resources that you have access to, and getting rid of that gate, kind of that bastion host that you allow people in, then they get access to everything. It does need to change. So it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out and see how many people actually pick it up.
For sure. And speaking of Active Directory, I met with Sempiris. And I have to say,
not heard of them. They were so
their CEO I have to say he's a riot. Mickey, he's awesome. He's awesome. He had me laughing. It was a very smart and very entertaining person to take a briefing with. And so the story's pretty. It's pretty straightforward. I like this a lot because basically he's like, look, we let people back up and restore their AD, and I'm like, well, doesn't Microsoft? He's like, no, he's like, system state, I think, is what Microsoft has. He's like, but the problem is it's not flexible. In other words, I can't take a physical system, take a backup of my Active Directory, and then put it somewhere in Azure in the cloud. Like, Microsoft doesn't let you do that, which I thought was weird. And I've spoken with Sempiris in the past too, and I thought it was weird when I first came into it. He's like, basically, look, we let you back up your Active Directory structure and restore it anywhere. So if it's running in VMware, you want to go to a physical system, or if it's on a physical system, you want to go to the cloud. He's like, you can back up and restore it anywhere. There's a great story there for, ransomware or other massive attacks that are happening where you might need to restore your Active Directory, right? And go back before the breach. And so that's problematic. And so they solved that problem with backup and recovery of Active Directory. I'm like, yeah, I think a lot of people could use that for sure, which is awesome. The other thing that was interesting is their other product, I don't remember the name of it, but there's another product that they have that allows you to do some forensics on what happened in Active Directory. So, let's say
a services protector?
I think I don't remember. It's in my notes somewhere, but what did he call it? Directory Services Detection. Yeah, I'll get the right name of it during the break. But so their second product, basically what it does is Active Directory creates logs, and we all know, right? We saw Carlos's technical segment about bypassing sysmon. We all know the attackers get in, and now they got domain admin. Okay, how do I go cover my tracks? And then how do I make it so that when I access stuff as domain admin, it's not being logged, right? John, I'm sure your testers do some level of this to hide their presence and basically wipe away any evidence that I was there, as to not throw up any alarms. So attackers in there and they're doing that. What their what is it called? The directory service detection product does is, in addition to the log that's generated by Active Directory, they're using the replication API to generate their own log and their own audit log. And so after you recover from a breach, basically you go into their solution and you say, okay, here's the Active Directory logs, here's the logs that you have, it's stored in a database. Okay, now tell me everything that the attacker did. Like, do a diff between Active Directory logs and the logs that were collected through the Active Directory domain controller replication API. You do a diff, and they basically tell you, well, yeah, like this doesn't match, so the attacker like did this, and you're like, okay, now go back in and revert all the changes that they did in Active Directory, so you can undo what the attacker did while they were in there based on this audit log and the diff. I'm like, well, that's awesome. That's useful for sure.
Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like, you have Tripwire for network devices, Tripwire for hosts. It's almost like a Tripwire for Active Directory.
Yeah, absolutely.
And right now, just trying to parse what happens in an Active Directory environment just by the event logs themselves is an absolute nightmare.
Nightmare. And so I thought that was, having a tool where you can go in and say, well, this is what an attacker did. You just like undo everything that attacker did. Like, that's so useful. As you know, John, I mean, Active Directory is one of the number one targets that, pen test teams and attackers are going after. So, yeah, that was awesome. And let's see. Oh, so John, with email security, it's kind of interesting. You and I have been using PGP for a long time, right? Because we're security nerds, so we can go get PGP keys. We can encrypt emails to each other. We can take files and encrypt them and send them to each other. And then it doesn't matter if most of the time, it doesn't matter if an attacker ends up with some of that data, because it's been encrypted with my key or your key or whoever's key, and we're the only people that can look at it, right? That's why we did that. Now, as you know, and many of us know, it's a lot of manual work to set that up and do that. So many companies are emerging now to allow enterprises to roll this out enterprise-wide, to allow users to encrypt email to each other, to say, I want to share this file with someone, and have that file be encrypted with their public key and send it to them, so only they can see it. Even an administrator can't come in and see that. The one company that we spoke with was Prevail, and they have a solution for that. First of all, I think this is a pretty crowded market, John. You can probably think of half a dozen different solutions, for doing this. And they're trying to make it easy for users to encrypt email. They are keeping the admins out, right? Because it's the keys. And the big problem that I think you have to address in the space, which Prevail is addressing, and because I asked them the very pointed question was, when John and I are sending encrypted emails and files back and forth to each other, what if my private key becomes compromised? Now I need a new private key. What happens to all the data that I encrypted with that old key, and how do I get a new key? And this is one of the things where a commercial solution's coming in and saying, yeah, we can issue a user a new key, but guess what? They can still decrypt all of their files that they encrypted with the old key, and we can expire the old key because of, fancy crypto stuff that, we'll talk about in a future segment. But that's the high-level functionality that they're allowing, making it easier to also reissue those keys from an administrative perspective. And so that's Prevail, and like I said, there's a lot of companies that are trying to do this as well. But
did you get a chance to talk to them about like Ediscovery or searching through these files as well?
I did not, because that's problematic too. How do you? Because then you got to escrow a key that can decrypt that data. That's another good point.
And for some organizations, that may not be a problem, right?
Sure.
Like making sure everything's encrypted is their biggest concern. But in some organizations, they may want to search through all their files or try to track where things are too. So and a lot of these vendors are coming up with, like you mentioned, like a key escrow or master key that can actually search everything. So it's interesting to see how they address those concerns.
And I'm sure you've used I remember back when we were doing pen tests together and I was doing pen tests on my own. How do you share the results, right? You just don't want to send that clear text. And a lot of organizations all had their different technologies they were using. They're like, send me the results using, this technology. Is it Zix? Zix is still, would you say?
Zix. I don't see Zix anymore.
Oh, okay.
Never. Yeah, never.
We've
if you're looking
at
most organizations, they're using Box.com and they're just relying on the built-in encryption that Box actually supports.
Okay.
And that's as long as it checks the box for the crypto standards for whatever compliance that they're actually working through, like 852 or anything like that, this 140, any of those, they're like, yep, that's good. Checkbox, hit, move on. So no, I'm not seeing Zix with hardly any of our customers anymore at all.
Interesting. Yeah, Prevail also has an encrypted file service. You use their service and you can encrypt files, the same keys and the same structure, which is nice rather than having one solution for email and one solution for Box to do files, right? You can consolidate it down into one. And I don't know, Box is a, cloud. I don't know how their encryption works and what the differences are, but that's something we can dig into, in future briefings as to how that actually works. I was curious to learn what, you and your customers are using, John, because it's a good use case for it.
It's funny because this, you talk about the use case for this, and I'm not saying our system is the absolute best because, like you mentioned earlier, you almost have to always adapt with whatever your customer is comfortable with using.
Yeah.
But I would say the vast majority of our customers are comfortable with just Box. Two-factor authentication enabled, and the fact that it's encrypted at rest on Box's servers tends to make them happy enough.
Sure. For the pen test results, right? I mean, other data could be a much different level of security, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We do, and we still have a lot of customers that are straight up GPG. Just encrypt it and send it over that way.
Sure. So that was kind of a rundown of some of the briefings we did recently, which is a lot of fun. I'm glad we get to dig into some of and share that with our audience, right? That's the goal of the show. So hopefully you learn something. If you're using these products or a different product and you got opinions, facts, send them over. I want to hear the listener's opinion on a lot of these different solutions. So send us feedback. psw@securityweekly.com. With that, we'll take a short break, come back, cover the enterprise security news. Stay tuned.